Welcome to the Archaic Revolution. We're going to cover four main themes or issues this week. First is the formation of the polis. The Archaic period was the time of the formation of the polis. We're going to talk about the way that these polis were created, how they were governed, and compare them to the type of organization called an ethnos. Next, we're going to look at forms of government of these polis. We're going to look at oligarchy, tyranny, and the relationship of the demos, or the people, to the tyrant, because it's a pretty interesting symbiotic relationship. Next, we're going to look at the Hoplite Revolution, army innovation, Hoplite Warfare, and the development of the phalanx. Finally, we're going to look at Panhellenic Greece, particularly the Panhellenic sanctuaries of Olympia and Delphi, and how they compare to the culture of these local polis. So the Archaic period lasted from 776 BCE to around 479 BCE. That is, it started in the 8th century and lasted till the beginning of the 5th. It's sometimes dated from the writing of the Homeric poems, but 776 is the date of the first playing or the first celebration of the Olympic Games, and 479 is the date of the end of the Persian Wars. So the Archaic period lasts from when the Olympic Games started to be played to the end of the Persian Wars. In the Archaic period, iron began to be worked with new sophistication. The population of Greece grew, and the alphabet was taken over from Phoenicia in the east. Colonies began to be sent out in a more organized way in this period. This is a topic we're going to touch on later. Crucially, the 8th century was also the age of polis formation and political Synoicism. Perhaps the formation of the polis was a result in part of the colonizing movement. Also, the Archaic period dealt with the rise of religious leagues and amphictyonies that grew up around Delphi and Olympia. Now, the people, the demos, were the citizens of the polis. The polis was the geographical area of the city and its surrounding territory, making up a single self-governing political unit. There was shared religious worship among the citizens of a polis. The political system of the polis usually consisted of an assembly of fighting men, which were the citizens, and then a council of elders, which advised this assembly. Each polis had its own religion, shrines, and most were quite small. Most were in one main city and its surrounding plain. That is, a few small villages that needed to unite into this polis structure. We're going to start here with a theme that's going to continue, which is a comparison between two of the most famous and large polis in the Archaic and Classical period, that is Athens and Sparta. Athens and Attica, which is the area surrounding Athens, was relatively large, with many towns spread out around its periphery. Now, Sparta and Laconia, Sparta had actually conquered violently its nearby areas and enslaved its inhabitants to work for them, was a different dynamic. Another important term to focus on here is Synoicism. This term refers to the combination of several smaller communities to form a single large polis or community. So sometimes this union did not affect the dynamics of the population dispersal or the settlements or the physical existence of separate communities within the polis. And this is actually what is supposed to have happened to Athens when its Synoicism is attributed to Theseus. In other times, Synoicism was conceived of as a sort of cohesive migration of citizens to the new city. So here is Attica. We have Rhamnus, Marathon to the northeast, the site of the famous battle. We have Sunion, the site of the Temple of Poseidon to the southeast. Other famous sites include Decalia and Eleusis to the west. These are just some of the important population centers of Attica. Athens is the polis proper of Attica, and it contains the Acropolis. The Greeks define themselves as belonging to a polis. The polis and Greece are inseparable. Aristotle says that, quote, humans are beings who by nature live in a polis. Now, in contrast, an ethnos was a regional territory without a unifying urban center or central government. It was just a loose association of autonomous towns and villages. Still, it still had a sense of identity as a single people. Crucially, members of an ethnos worshiped the same gods and had the same federal sanctuary, as well as a means to reach communal decisions. Examples of these ethnae, plural, are the Aetolians, the Acarnanians, the Thessalians to the north. There are many others. Most are actually in northern Greece. Now, the ability to raise a large force, military force, was of course key to a polis's success. The less well Synoicized a polis territory was, the harder it was to raise a large force. Hence, most northern regions of Greece never became great political powers because of this difficulty in organizing around one single polis. So how did these nation polis in the Archaic period govern themselves? If we look to the past, that is the last time there was a systematic and coherent system of governance in the Bronze Age before it fell, Here in the Archaic period in the polis, there was no paramount basileus or king, as we find in either some of the archaeological remains of the Bronze Age period or later, or even in the pages of the Odyssey on Ithaca in the figure of Odysseus himself as the ruler of his house. With the population growth in the 8th and the 7th centuries, a land-owning aristocracy developed, which now portioned out their power in several quasi-municipal or traditional offices or roles, which then were passed down to their descendants. They ruled collectively. These two forms of governance are called aristocracy and oligarchy. Aristocracy comes from the Greek term aristos, as an adjective meaning the best, so the aristoi are the best men. The part of the word krasi comes from the noun kratos, meaning power. So aristocracy is the rule of the best. Similarly, oligarchy comes from the term oligos, meaning few, so the oligoi mean the few, and then krasi again comes from kratos. Oligarchy means rule of the few. Of course, the number of official roles and magistrates grew with the population, and the power of the community centered on the boule, the council, or the group of old men who advised the assembly. Now, this entire system was underpinned by a schematic ideology of kakoi versus agathoi. This is a moral ideology, poor versus elite. It was the bad versus the good. So here, the bad versus the good is actually equivalent to the poor versus the rich. This ideological scheme explicitly equates Kalos, beauty, with Agathos, good, and with Plutos, rich. On the other hand, the term kakos, which meant bad, came to mean the opposite of all three of those terms: Kalos, Agathos, and Plutos. With increased production, population, and technology, the power of the common people grew, but so does the gap between the rich and poor. We're going to talk more about this later. Now we come to one of the signal developments of the Archaic period in Greece, which was tyranny. Now, rivalry between the powerful aristocratic family clans often led to violence and civic disorder in these polis, and eventually to the rise of a single ruler called the Tyrant. Usually, the demos, which was the general citizen body, the common citizens, might support a single ambitious aristocrat making promises to overthrow the feuding and unjust ruling oligarchy, and put a stop to the civic violence and elite exploitation of the common man. Some common methods of obtaining a tyranny were: a would-be tyrant would explicitly claim to be the champion of the people, would defend their interests versus the rich most of the time, and in a mechanical sense, in order to take power, a would-be tyrant would fake an attack from abroad and actually ask for a bodyguard from the common people in order to get control. This was the tactic of the Athenian tyrant, Pisistratus. You could also get support from another would-be tyrant that would be your friend, and this is the Athenian Cylon tried to do. Of course, often the demos, the common people, were not fully satisfied with the rule of an aristocracy either, as compared to an aristocracy or an oligarchy. Individual aristocrats craved more power. As a result, some of these ambitious aristocrats would strike out on their own and make claims that they're going to bring the ruling class to justice and end civic violence, as we mentioned. Once one of these individuals would gain popular support like this and get elected through the support of the demos, they may have enough power to overthrow the government and hang on to their power. And this, in essence, is the tyranny. Later traditions maintained, usually in a sense of wishful thinking or just hope, that the power of a tyranny was naturally short-lived. Whether this is true or not, it's hard to say. That as a hereditary system, usually a tyranny would pass on their power to their descendants. And as this hereditary system sort of developed or drew out, support usually ran out for the tyranny after 1 or 2 generations. Tyranny was, in fact, hard to maintain because, first, the opposition from the excluded elite. Obviously, these are your natural enemies. Second, they often didn't do much to further the interests of the polis as a whole. Of course, there are some exceptions to this. Patronage of the arts and infrastructure are two. So these are your two natural enemies if you're a tyrant. Obviously, most importantly, the excluded elite, the aristocracy who you've totally disenfranchised, and then the demos who have been responsible for your elevation, but you have to maintain their support. So in order to maintain their power, tyrants would often resort to payoffs or bribes of exiles or just executions, and this obviously couldn't go on forever. One's list of friends as a tyrant would shrink to minuscule proportions, and your list of enemies would grow exponentially. And unfortunately, you couldn't exile or kill them all, although some tried. The upshot of all this is by the end of the Archaic period, by around 500 BCE, just before the Persian Wars, the tyrannies are all disappearing. The Spartan policy of overthrowing tyrannies, especially and crucially the Pisistrates of Athens, contributed to the decline of tyranny in the late Archaic period. In their place, these groups, these cliques of aristocratic ruling classes, the oligarchies, would pop back up, less often, but occasionally a democracy would pop up, and this is what happened in 5th century Athens. So still, it is fundamental to recognize that tyranny itself is not a retrograde step back from aristocracy or oligarchy per se. It's a development from these, and its development is actually evidence of the growing power of the demos at the time in the Archaic period. Tyrants all based their claim to power on popular support. If we take just one simple example, let's take, for example, the famous story in Herodotus of Periander of Corinth and the advice he took from Thrasybulus, the tyrant of Miletus. For Periander, at the beginning of his reign, was of a milder temper than his father. But after he corresponded by means of messengers with Thrasybulus, tyrant of Miletus, he became even more bloodthirsty. On one occasion, he sent a herald to ask Thrasybulus what mode of government it was safest to set up in order to rule with honor. Thrasybulus led the messenger outside of the city and took him into a field of corn, through which he began to walk, while he asked him again and again concerning his coming from Corinth. And as he did this, he went breaking off and throwing away all such ears of corn as overtopped the rest. In this way he went through the whole field and destroyed all the best and the richest part of the crop. Then, without a word, he sent the messenger back. So it's notable here that Periander was told, through this metaphor of chopping off all the top of the wheat, to kill the preeminent citizens, not the common people. So the most notable enemies of the tyrant were the deposed oligarchic peers. All of the famous tyrants of Archaic Greece were in the early to mid 7th century. We have the Orthagorids of Sikyon, whose dynasty began in 650 and lasted for a century. The Kypselids of Corinth, which was one of the earliest tyrant dynasties and one of the longest lasting. Kypselus overthrew the aristocracy in Corinth, a group called the Bacchiads, and he was followed by his son Periander, and finally by Periander's nephew, also called Kypselus, who was then deposed. Theagenes of Megara confiscated the possessions and wealth of the aristocracy, secured a bodyguard, and made himself tyrant. He later supported the Athenian Cylon's unsuccessful attempt to make himself tyrant at Athens. At Mytilene, Pittacus, who was one of the 7 sages along with Cylon of Athens, actually overthrew an earlier tyrant, Melancros, but then became tyrant himself, of course according to his archenemy, the poet Alcaeus, who didn't like him at all. The tyrant Polycrates seized control of the island Samos at around 535 BCE with his brothers Pantagnatus and Siloson. The Pisistrates of Athens, that is Pisistratus and his sons Hippias and Hipparchus, we'll come to later. Cylon of Athens is a very early and interesting example of a tyrant. Cylon was a very prominent individual, an Olympic victor in the mid-7th century. And sometime in the 630s, Cylon supporters decided to make an attempt at tyranny in Athens. They sat as suppliants at the Temple of Athena and were only removed with a promise of safe passage. However, they were betrayed and killed, and those who killed them were later expelled from Athens for actually ignoring the religious scruples against removing somebody from a temple. This will come up again during the Peloponnesian War. Now, the poet Theognis of Megara has a lot of very interesting comments on the nature of tyranny. He says to his interlocutor, "Kurnos, this city is pregnant, and I fear that she may bear a man who will correct our hubris. For even if her citizens are still prudent, her leaders have descended to great wickedness. Good men, Kurnos, have not yet destroyed a city. But when it pleases evil aristocrats to be insolent, and they corrupt the people and give judgment in favor of the unjust for their own sake or for their own gain and advancement, do not think that the city will remain untroubled long, not even if it now lies in great tranquility, when these things become dear to base men. Their personal gains will bring public misfortune, for from such come discords, and kindred murders and sole rulers. May they never be pleasing to this city." Of course, there were some positive sides to tyranny. They tended to be patrons of the arts and poetry. For example, Polycrates and Pisistratus both promoted poets, and Pisistratus instituted the Panhellenic and supposedly edited the Homeric poems for performance by rhapsodes. City infrastructure was often improved by tyrants, harbors, drainage systems. These provided jobs. Phaedon, a tyrant of Argos, standardized Peloponnesian weights and measures in the 7th century. Periander of Corinth built a stone canal in Corinth. So here's a list of the 7 sages of Archaic Greece. The group included philosophers, tyrants, and statesmen. This is an indication that tyrants didn't always have a negative reputation. So there's not always a negative connotation to the word tyrant. We have Cleobulus of Lindos, the famous Solon of Athens, Cylon of Sparta, Thales of Miletus, Pittacus of Mytilene, Bias of Priene, and the Cypselid Periander of Corinth. It might be a bit counterintuitive to understand that the rise of the tyrannies was actually a function of population growth in the early Archaic period, and the growth of the power of the demos. This development goes hand in hand with the development and the creation of the Hoplite phalanx, the Hoplite Revolution.
Come and get them!
The word hoplite comes from hoplites, meaning he who is armed. Hoplon is equipment or shield. The plural is hopla, meaning weapons. At around 720 BCE, the hoplite panoply appears in art and in burials. For example, here is the Kiji vase, which gives us evidence that in the Archaic period, by around 650 BCE, the phalanx was fully developed. So what is phalanx warfare? The hoplite panoply or equipment consisted of 50 to 70 pound armor, a breastplate, a 6 to 8 foot spear with a bronze butt, a bronze helmet, this is in the Corinthian style, and a 3-foot concave wooden shield. The phalanx was essentially a group of warriors armored in this way and arranged in a specific manner. Shield on the left side with the right side exposed, linked together so the line must hold together. In this system, the bravery of every single man was crucial. Phalanx was usually 8 deep, and there were 2 weak points to each man's armor, the neck and the groin. The dynamics of hoplite warfare were significantly different than modern-day fighting. The campaigns were always in summer. In winter, you couldn't campaign. And in summer, farmers didn't have to sow crops or harvest, so summer was the only natural time. There was always a formal declaration of war and religious pre-battle speeches, sacrifices, and divination, and usually followed a mechanical sequence of first there was a charge, then there was a collision, then both sides pushed against each other, and one side was routed, hopefully. Because of the technique of overlapping shields, there was a tendency to drift right, since that was the unprotected side. The victorious side would then sit up a trophy, or a tropion, literally the thing at the turning point of the battle. And a truce was always struck after battle for each side to collect the dead. This was a religious tenet. So what was so revolutionary about hoplite warfare? In the 700s and earlier, fewer could actually afford their own armor or be away from a farm on campaign, and thus the elite had much more influence than the common man in the army and in power generally. An extreme example of this is the battle scenes in the Iliad, which emphasize single heroic figures striding around and riding their chariots. Portions of this are actually anachronistic even for the Bronze Age. This starts to change over the Archaic period, over the 700s and 600s, during the Hoplite Revolution. In this period, more citizen farmers could afford hoplite weapons, and this possession of a means to defend one's own city was crucial to the access to power. Access to armor allowed all of a city's men to have equal share and equal right in defending the land. So, equal share in owning land or in making political decisions was thus easier to demand and obtain. The aristocracy's dominance of the sphere of political power had to increasingly reckon with the influence of these citizen farmer soldiers of the middle class in this period. The Hoplite Revolution, among other factors, ended the elite's dominant role in warfare and led to changes in the ideology that defined the polis. All men could share in the burden of the war. It was easier to argue that the burden and privileges of making civic decisions should be shared by all as well. It's important here to realize that the Hoplite Revolution didn't mean that every city immediately became a democracy, but it did mean that many oligarchies distributed power less unevenly because they needed to, and in some cases democracies actually did arise. Now, alongside the rise of the polis, tyranny, and the hoplite warfare in the 7th century, we also see the rise of Panhellenic sanctuaries. These sanctuaries are in some senses countervailing forces to the localized force of the polis. The city, or the polis, tended towards provincialism and localism. The large sanctuaries, such as Delphi and Olympia, tended towards Panhellenism, that is, a sense of oneness among the Greeks. So how did these sanctuaries come about? In the Dark Ages, or in the Early Iron Age, from 1100 to 800 BCE, the production of both large and small-scale figurines in all materials had dwindled down to practically nothing. This was the end of the Bronze Age. Now, at the end of the 8th century in our period, sites such as Delphi and Phocis and Olympia on the Peloponnese, and those connected to emerging cities or polis such as the Argive Heraion and the Athenian Acropolis, they began to receive dedications and gifts of all types in this period, especially bronze on a huge scale. This is the emergence out of the Dark Ages. These gifts or holy objects are actually similar to those found on the Bronze Age Minoan peak sanctuaries and Mycenaean religious sites of the Bronze Age. Bronze and statues of horses perhaps represented the wealth of their owners. Warriors, mythical creatures, cauldrons represented in some way personal presence or reputation at these sanctuaries. Perhaps there was an element of piety or social aggrandizement. Now, further afield, Pericor in the Argolid and Samos in Ionia in the 700s, and Isthmia and Corinth in the 600s, all obtained this influx of wealth and also some kind of monumental religious architecture to go along with it to mark the global scope of their religious influence. The two most important religious sites for all of Greece were Delphi and Olympia. They both celebrated Panhellenic Games or Agones, and Delphi was famous for the oracle, the Pythia priestess and her prophecy. 776 BCE is the start of the Archaic Period. It's the first hard data point for the institution of the Olympic Games, and because of this date's later use by historians and antiquarian chroniclers, 776 is the first date in the history of ancient Greece. For example, Hippias of Elis wrote his Olympionikai, or Olympic victors, using winners in the stadion race or foot race at Olympia. Centuries later, this list was regularized with the archon lists at Athens and the consul lists at Rome, and finally with the lists of Roman emperors and popes to give us the backbone of our understanding of chronology of the ancient world. That's how fundamental this date is. The Olympic Games at Olympia were celebrated every 4 years, but it was Aristotle who was responsible for the reworking of Hippias's list to add the intervening numbers to the years of the Olympiad, so the first, second, third, and fourth year of each Olympiad. The Olympian Games were founded in 776 BCE and were dedicated to Olympian Zeus. They occurred once every 4 years, or fifth year, for 5 days. They were celebrated at the end of July and through the end of July to the beginning of August. They started with a sacrifice of 100 bulls or a hecatomb on the ash altar of Zeus at Olympia. It was extremely hot in this period. There was a procession from the town of Elis, which actually oversaw the festival. It included the athletes and the magistrates. There were perhaps as many as 50,000 and maybe 100,000 spectators at each of their events. It was a little bit like Glastonbury or Burning Man. There were no permanent facilities for anyone until really, really late, hundreds of years after 776. 4th century BCE is when they first started building purpose-built buildings for the Olympic Games. Events included the stadion race, the discus, halma the long jump, akon the javelin, pale the wrestling, pix or boxing, and the pankration, which is a lot like MMA. It was an anything goes battle competition. The topography of the sanctuary at Olympia centered on the Altus, or sacred grove, which contained the grave of the mythological founder of the games, Pelops, the son of Oenomaus, and the namesake of the Peloponnesus itself. It stands for Pelops Island. Now, the Temple of Zeus was not actually the first temple at Olympia. The Temple of Hera was the first temple built on the site in the early 7th century, and so it's one of the earliest archaic temples in Greece. It was replaced by around 590 BCE. That's very early itself. Its architecture represents a transition from building in wood to monumental stone Doric columns that are so characteristic of what we think of as ancient Greek architecture. The Roman-era travel writer Pausanias, who is still fundamental to our understanding of so many parts of ancient history, actually says that he saw in the 3rd century AD a wooden column in the Temple of Hera at Olympia. Now, the temple to Zeus was built much later in the early 5th century, a little bit out of the Archaic period. And when it was completed, it was the largest Doric temple in Greek mainland. That is until the Athenian Parthenon was built. It was built with standard Doric columns in a 6x13 orientation. It was built of limestone with some stucco elements to create the vertical walls. It was not completed until 430 BCE. And it famously contained the statue of Olympian Zeus by the famous sculptor Phidias in the classical period. We call this statue chryselephantine. That's because it was made of gold and ivory. The metopes of the temple to Zeus depict famously the labors of Heracles. In many instances, they are the earliest depictions that we have of them at all. The pediments depict two foundational stories in the history of the sanctuary. The east or front side shows Zeus and the story of Pelops and Oenomaus, the founding of the Olympian Games. That is the chariot race, which serves as the aition for the games themselves, the founding moment of the Olympic Games. The west or the backside pediment shows the god Apollo with the lapis battling with the centaurs at the wedding of the feast of Perithous. So that's the end of our quick overview of the Archaic Revolution in the Archaic period in Olympia. Next time we're going to take a look at the social structure of Archaic Greece, colonization, and the Archaic Greek lyric poetry. Thanks a lot, guys.